welcome to the show. This is going to be a fun one today, although the topics we got, there's kind of a theme that we'll be landing on.
All right. Are you sharing the theme yet?
We'll get there in just a second.
All right. For everyone listening, it's probably already in the title of the show. So here we go.
There should be some aspect that gives you a heads up of where we're going.
Well, in that you've talked about in the future having call-ins or something like that. Where are we with having the call-in?
Right. So we've been talking about trying to create a slightly different segment that we can add every so often, which is just a call-in aspect to the show, which is because throughout the years of Sexy Marriage Radio, which welcome to Sexy Marriage Radio, by the way, this is my wife, Pam, already talking, and myself, Dr. Allen. And we've always had a thread of the nation helps steer where we go. Their questions. That's what we're doing today. Is we've got a slew of questions we'll be going through that have come in via email, and what we want to try to do is also pivot some and get to where it's more of a dialogue, so we get more detail to really help and speak to the aspects of what's going on with the people in the nation that are facing some sort of a trouble point, struggle, or even big issue in their marriage. Because there is a lot of detail that can really help and will steer where we go.
Right. And lots of times we just go on some assumptions.
Right. We do. And a lot of those I think can still be applicable because we try to frame conversations. But if we want to frame specific conversations to help people make better moves in and of itself within their situation, we need the dialogue. Okay. And so where that stands is this is where we rely on the nation to have the courage to speak into this and call in and set it up.
It can be hard to do.
Say, absolutely.
I don't want someone to hear my voice.
And we can protect you some with this. I mean, we can change names, locations, and some details. That is not a problem at all. We'll work ahead of time to help frame it, to really speak to what's going on with you, but also make it to where if you're concerned about, I don't want that information out there, then we'll do what we can to fix it. Plus, any segment, none of them are actually live. Like we don't record this live where it's going out on the air as we're talking right now. So if at the end of the segment you feel like, you know what, I don't want that going out, all you got to do is say so. And then you got the benefit of the dialogue with us or with me that can help, hopefully, with where you are. And so email us at feedback@sexymarriageradio.com if you want to take advantage of this. If you email in something for the show or already have, I've already replied to you about, hey, would love it if you'd want to take this a little bit further and speak directly to it. And then we just schedule it. We'll set it up. We'll prep you. And then we'll go. And so it's coming, but it's a little slower than we were hoping at this point. And so nation, come on, let's get this rolling, because I think this could be a fun segment that really will help some people.
Yeah.
Because as you've said a lot of times, Pam, there's always been this thread of if you have an issue in your marriage, we can often think we're the only ones. Like when we've been through really rough patches, it's really easy for you or I to think we're the only ones facing this. Until lo and behold, you open your mouth and you say something to somebody else and they're like, oh yeah, we are in that too. Or we just came out of that. Or so you're not alone ever in the struggles of marriage.
Yeah.
And so what we're hoping to have happen with Sexy Marriage Radio, if you're new to the show, we're so glad you found us. And the way you can let us know how you want to be a part of it or just add to the dialogue we've got is 214-702-9565 is the voicemail line we have. Or feedback@sexymarriageradio.com is the email address we've had for almost 13 years now that we've been on the air. And we love to have the chance to engage with the audience as it goes forth each and every day. And also, last little plug I'll make the comment about is I've got a chance to teach a Marriage by Divine Design as a course and series I'm putting together at our church here in the McKinney area. So if you live anywhere,
Texas.
I'm sure there's other McKinneys. Good point.
Oh, yeah.
And so if you're anywhere in the North Dallas area, or you want to drive a little bit on Sunday nights at 6 p.m., getting a chance to walk through my thought processes as it pertains to marriage and some of the design and intent therein. So Come
So,
join us.
Yeah, email us and we'll give you details about where that is.
Yeah, feedback@sexymarriageradio.com is how you would do this. So coming up on today's regular free version of the show, Pam, is a couple of different emails. One came in from a wife who is saying the lack of intentionality from her husband in all areas of his life
Okay.
is really unattractive and it's affecting their marriage. And then another email that came in from a husband who says that the wife disclosed about some sexual trauma early in their dating, didn't impact them at the time, but now is. And so he thinks that's what's impacting their sex life, even though she says it's not.
Interesting. Okay.
So that'll be a nice framing to figure out what do we do about that.
Right.
And then on the extended content today, which is deeper, longer, and there's no ads, you can subscribe at smr.fm/academy. Another email has come in from a wife that's on the same thread we've got going on, because basically the thread for today's episode is my spouse is the problem, right? And so she's coming in at it, though that's her husband's stance, that if she would just get fixed, according to husband, they would have an okay sex life. And so she's really struggling with, how do I deal with the idea and aspects of obligation sex? I give him sex, that whole kind of framework, which we touched on last week with Sam Jolman in the extended content. So there might be a little building off of, but we're going to go a slightly different way in talking about what do you do when you're caught in this dynamic and dilemma. And so all that's coming up right after this. So here's the email that came in. Let's just set it up. A wife that emails in saying, I love the show, especially the recent episode with Emily Nagowski, which was several weeks ago.
Okay.
But it got me thinking about patterns in my marriage. My husband in particular seems to struggle with a lack of intentionality, not just in the marriage, but in his life in general. If I could narrow down all our problems to one root cause, it'd be the lack of direction and lack of intentionality I see from my husband's leadership in our marriage. He's got lots of great ideas. He knows where he struggles and what our marriage needs to thrive. But he either doesn't know how to get there or is just too plain too lazy or unmotivated to change his habits and create a life and marriage he says he wants. We've been at an impasse for a couple of years, and I've been asking for change for years, and he's making me promises for years. But he's proved time and time again that he's just not a man of his word, either to me or himself. I struggle with wanting to check out in our marriage as well as having compassion and patience. Needless to say, our intimacy and sex life is strained. So what do you have to say about living intentionally in marriage and not only surviving, but thriving in a marriage where intentionality is lacking in one of the two spouses? Thanks. This is an interesting one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can see where there would be struggle when you feel like that your spouse is lazy any area, but multiple areas, right? So you can see where her struggle is coming from. I'm curious, is there reframing that needs to happen?
There absolutely is, because this is the biggest thing that jumps out to this is I could narrow down all our marriage problems to one root cause. It's the lack of his direction and intentionality, which then begs the question, ma'am, what's your role? Because it sounds like there's this element of, I just need you to fill in the blank and I will be okay, which is a powerless stance.
Yeah.
Right. And I realize it's not one, it's having to face something in the manner in which you don't really want to face it, but that's what you're facing.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it of what is it that makes you dependent on that dynamic, where is that message, that belief structure coming from? Because a lot of this can be coming from a Christian ethos of the husband is the head of the household. He sets the intentionality and the tone. And so therefore he should lead, which all of those words in there, intentionality, tone,
I don't think intentionality
lead,
was a biblical
thing. I don't either, but it's still, all of those different words have, the definitions are completely dependent on the person and how you define it.
Yeah.
Because you and I have a difference in the whole world of intentionality. or leading or
I'm thinking back to scenarios that we've shared on the show probably multiple times before. I had the same train of thought at one point.
sure.
Not maybe on every aspect of your life, but specific aspects, right?
Yeah.
We've shared the story about Saturday, you like to watch football, right? No matter what the game, you don't have necessarily a favorite team.
I don't
You
have
just
a
love
team.
watching,
I just like watching it.
right?
Yes.
And it's college football on Saturday, lots of fun. And I like that to an extent.
It's Boise
But-
Technical Institute versus the Colorado School of Mines. It doesn't matter to me. I'm watching.
Right. And I'd like to have some sort of knowledge of the teams that I'm watching. Anyway, that's too much detail. But I was getting fed up with it.
Mhm.
Right. This is when the kids were younger. And I was like, let's go out and do something together. And after months or however long, maybe years,
A year and a half.
of complaining and saying, we need to stop watching so much TV, I finally had to have a mindset change and say, here's what I'm going to do. Honey, I'm going to get out and do things. I'm going to XYZ, in essence, be intentional about what I want. You can come join me or you can stay here.
Right.
Some days I'll take the kids, some days I won't, but I'm not going to keep doing this anymore.
Right.
And I had to make that decision myself to do it with or without you.
Which is a courageous move, which is why oftentimes we really struggle doing that. Because if you think about it, on the outset of that kind of a pivot and decision, you're actually pivoting of the marriage, not entirely, but you're pivoting out of how the marriage is, which could ultimately head towards out of the marriage, which is why we don't want to make these moves, because we think way too many steps ahead, thinking, well, this is all I got left. I either have to just suck it up and this is what I have to deal with, or I've got to take ownership of my own self and my own life and pivot it and see how my spouse responds.
Yeah, one step at a time.
Mm-hmm.
See how that response goes. But I'm curious of all the different areas that he's not being intentional. How is it that you can just be intentional and do what is important to you?
Right. And then because until you make a move that puts you in a differentiated stance where I've separated myself some, I'm not as reliant, I'm not as interwoven as far as my identity, my value, my power or strength isn't dependent on you as much, then you can really face, okay, now I can speak to the other person as a separate person. Okay, these aspects of how you are doing life, and this is what she's hinted at, are incredibly unattractive to me. So
That's
I've got
legit.
a dilemma
That's unattractive.
now.
Mm-hmm.
And that dilemma is I want to be with you. I want to be attracted to you, and I'm not. And that can be that's kind of a two-pronged statement of I need to own my dilemma, but too often we frame it as you need to make yourself more attractive to me, which that's kind of the underweaving all the way through this the way I'm reading this.
Yeah.
And instead it's like, no, you need to, ma'am, face what do I do about the fact that I'm unattracted to my husband? Because that has little to do with him at the outset. Ultimately, it is an aspect you're going to have to face, but you have to come to grips with what do you do with that? Because if I truly come to grips with, well, this is just what it is, I can't blame, quote unquote, him because I'm choosing. This is just what it is, rather than, you know what? He makes a move. He asks me what's going on. He comes to bed and I'm fed up with him and he acts like nothing's going wrong. Nothing happened. You know, he's just kind of blowing through like a normal we all can do.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, I don't want to be around you right now. And so you go sleep on the couch that night. That sends a pretty decent message in some ways of like, I got a problem and I'm not trying to attack you with it. I'm just handling me different. That's what you did with the TV move. Follow up to that move the next weekend, you actually followed through with what you had said.
Yeah, you got to be willing to follow through
you got
on
up,
something.
you got around, and you left for the day. And it was like, oh, she's serious about this.
Yeah.
Right. This is okay. But it took you a long time to muster up the ability to do that. because you had to reframe, you had to wrestle, you had to go through. I mean, because I was alongside the whole thing and
Yeah.
watching it and sometimes getting a little scared, thinking, oh, this may be shifting. Well, that's what marriages do.
Yeah.
And so if you recognize that this is a dilemma, you have to see it as I have far too often made it about my spouse rather than what's my part? Because everything ultimately starts with me. There's just the theme right there.
Yeah.
And so how do I address that before I make my next move? And it's real hard to do that, but you've got to keep wrestling with what's my part? Not that I'm creating it, but what's my part in colluding with it? And I change that. That's my courageous move.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next email. It's similar vein, that I've been listening to your show for a year and a half and love all the insights. So I've challenged myself physically and mentally to show up better in my second marriage of 3.5 years, and we've made some great advances. I love my wife and family dearly. However, we're not physically intimate enough for my liking, and I've tried about every strategy there is. Sometimes it's good, sometimes not so good, and it hasn't created a consistent improvement. Full disclosure, my wife endured sexual abuse from a step parent during her early teenage years. She disclosed this to me about 2 months into dating. And while the sex and intimacy were hot and heavy, I wasn't equipped to handle this news at the time, but I listened, provided empathy, and tried to be non-judgmental. I've asked my wife directly if this past abuse a little over 20 years ago affects her, and she says it doesn't. I feel that it affects her and our intimate connection immensely. She doesn't like to be touched, prefers to have a few alcoholic drinks when we are intimate, and she rejects my flirting, or she doesn't flirt herself. So how do I bring this up to her in a way that is sensitive to the nature of what she's endured? I feel that she'd benefit from therapy as well as our marriage. She's in law enforcement, and so she tries to stay very busy and has tended to tell me that I'm overreacting when I suggest we do therapy and that our marriage is perfectly fine, even though our intimate relationship just isn't there. Thanks. So again, this is the same framework, different topic of how am I positioning myself, maybe unbeknownst to myself, of making the marriage problem I've got really about my spouse only, rather than facing what is my marriage problem that I've got.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, there's so many avenues this one could go down because you don't have her and her take on it. It's his assumption.
Well, and it's his map of her too, though, because there is this element of, and we've touched on this in the past, but we have, like in his case, he has the wife he's doing life with, and he has the wife in his mind. Sometimes those aren't the same people.
Yeah, those versions aren't congruent.
Right,
okay.
Because he is still relating to what optimal sex life and intimate life would be as the hot and heavy when it started, which all of us can tend to do because we're filled with all the chemicals that make it so easy because it's novel and it's unknown. It's so easy to, man, I just want to recreate that, but you just can't. And so we have to face that.
Well, even without recreating it, just the simple desire difference, right? And so he's concerned that they're not intimate enough. I'm assuming that means not having sex enough.
Yes.
And that just goes to the high desire, low desire, right? Yeah. So for her, we're having sex just as much as I'd enjoy to have it. I don't see a problem here.
Yeah.
And he's not getting enough, right? So maybe his map is right. Maybe it goes back to the trauma. Maybe.
Well, and this is a element, if you just go
maybe it's just desire
research
difference.
Statistical concepts here for a second, that there's correlation and there's causation. He's landing in the world of causation. This logically makes enough sense that if you had this happen in your past, this is going to be what's impacting the problem we've got now. Whereas she could be seeing it as, yeah, it could be a factor, but it's not. I've dealt with it. Yeah, I'm okay. Right. And those two are completely plausible for both sides of the equation here, his and hers.
And hers. Yeah.
Right. And so he's struggling and faced with, I don't believe that it doesn't affect her. And so now he's trying to get her to adopt his stance, whereas she's trying to get him to adopt her stance.
Yeah, because she says, I'm fine.
So the bigger question to me for the husband here is, how does that fact about your wife and the fact that what she has gone through affect you? Not you? How do you look at her differently? How do you address her differently? Because there's a possibility that has skewed you based on what he made the comment of. I couldn't handle it at first. I tried to be empathetic and
Right.
supportive, but
Right.
it impacted us because,
So, because what training has he gone through since then to know how to deal with it since then?
but how to face it and realize, okay, I've got to face the wife I've got in this. And if she says this isn't an issue, it's not a good stance to try to talk her into the fact that she's wrong.
Okay. Fair.
Right? Because we will dig our heels in as human beings in that regard. Even if there could be an element of truth that's like, you know what, maybe you're right. But trying to convince somebody is not a good way. And I hear what he's saying of how do I bring this up in a way that's sensitive? Well, he's already treating her as somebody that you have to tiptoe around on this subject.
Because he's assuming that she doesn't see how it's affecting her.
Right. Or he's seeing her as now different because of that.
Mm.
And it's hard not to, because it's all impacts of who we have evolved to be. When I hear these things, and it's like, wow, I still have to relate to that. But how do I relate to it from a stance of strength?
Yeah. I mean, you want to be sensitive to it, right? I mean, you don't want to trigger anything.
Well, that's an interesting framework of I don't want to trigger anything, because that's the reality of if it's there or not, it's going to happen.
Right. But you just don't want to be the person that might cause
Right. So
struggle in someone you love. Right.
Absolutely. Well, you don't want to unjustly attack them for something that's gone on.
Right.
Right. But there is this element of recognizing when he's sitting here saying the issues that he's facing ultimately boil down to we're not having enough sex. There's not enough banter and connection in the sexual arena of our life together. Well, one, his phraseology of she doesn't like to be touched. She prefers to have a few alcoholic drinks before we are intimate, and she rejects my flirting, and she doesn't flirt herself. Those aspects right there also define a lot of lower desires too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Which is why I just come at it on the desire difference.
There's a leveling that happens as you go into marriage in our sex lives that we will come back down from the chemical high of the new relationship.
Yeah.
And the desired difference and discrepancy will be more refined or defined.
Yeah. All of those things sound like a normal call in that we would have, whether or not there was trauma in the past.
Right. But if he is still stuck on, I believe this is an issue. In some regards, I believe he needs to adjust to see it as I'm going to take her at her word. But I still want to address the dilemma we have, which ultimately just is, because this is where it becomes so interesting.
And you're saying the dilemma we have is the desire difference.
The discrepancy between us on desires. Yes. But this is where it's so interesting with the two emails from this morning or today, because you might be listening to this in the afternoon, but is we can so easily frame our problem as something our spouse has done or isn't doing. And that is the linchpin that will solve my problem, rather than that's just a factor of it. The problem is still, how am I facing what's going on in real time between us?
Mm-hmm.
And for him, it's how do I bring up the fact that I'm not satisfied with the level of our sex life? Then it starts to become, well, what do you do to improve your side of it, sir? Which is largely, I instigate more. I flirt, even if she doesn't flirt back. I express,
and don't get offended if she doesn't flirt back, right, because that's kind of a turn off.
I start trying to be expressive and living the sex life I want and the sexual life I want. That's a better way to phrase it than sex life. But I start being the person I want to be, and I see if that draws her to me or not. And if it doesn't, then I've got a conversation point of like, hey, I'm just trying to live this dynamic towards the kind of relationship I'm wanting. I'm trying to head that direction. And there's a tension between us. And I'm curious if you feel it too. And I'm curious what you think, what could be factors. This is what I'm wrestling with. And and in some ways you have to let go of, it's because of this, i.e. the trauma.
Right.
And let her see if it's because of that or not. Because it could very well not be the trauma. There are people that have worked through it. And it's like, nope. but this is just the level of sex life and sexuality I want to live at. And that's where I am. But we so often start to think of our spouse as something that needs to be solved. That's never a good path or goal. If I'm trying to solve my spouse,
Yeah.
not a good goal. But if you can pivot and recognize, what's my culpability in this dynamic? How do I really take on myself and then take on my spouse? At least we got a different possible next step. And then if either of these listeners want more, let's do a call-in segment or email again.
Yeah.
And we'll pick
Yeah,
it up
give
there.
some more details.